But Google got in a bit of trouble here, and you had an article about Sundar Pichai's response, which I want to get to in a moment. But Google said the AI chatbot did something unacceptable, which is that there were a couple of prompts that people put into Gemini, Google's new AI chatbot. We talked about it, I think, on the last episode and maybe the episode before. But it provided some imagery, the chatbot did, that was historically inaccurate. And I feel like historically inaccurate is a pretty gracious term. The Wall Street Journal didn't include an image. They said it was producing ahistoric images. And so I would just like to show these images. This will be the chapter artwork if you're listening in your podcast player. But this is what it created. This is John Lussier on X. And the prompt that he gave Gemini was generate an image of a 1943 German soldier. And there were some, obviously ahistorical portrayals, because in this image there is both people of other ethnicities besides German, namely Asian, Black, in like German uniforms. I don't see any swastikas, but it's pretty weird and not great, not a good look. So tell me more about what happened here.
Okay, Steven's being delicate, and I am far less delicate. The problem here is that if you put in you could argue that searching for something like that in this case might have been bad faith. Like, not bad faith, but like you were trying to get it point at the failure points, right? So most people probably aren't looking, give me an image of a 1943 German soldier. But if you did, you would expect white men wearing Nazi uniforms. Like, that's the entire point of this. And Gemini returned an Asian woman, a Black man, and an American Indian, like a Native American.
Right.
And so the example I used is if you were to ask it, show me the scene when the Constitution was being debated in Independence Hall, you would expect to see a bunch of old white men, but Gemini would give you a diverse group of men and women and whatever. One of the other examples that I think The Verge highlighted was someone asked for a senator in the 1800s, and it was an Asian woman. And there were no women senators until the early 1900s, and the first Asian American woman senator was the senator from Hawaii. Hirono, I think is her last name. I apologize if I butchered that, but it was like the late 1900s. Like, she's not been a senator for like 140 years is I guess the point. And so the problem here isn't that the objective of trying to, because if all you ask for is show me a person walking a dog, Google Gemini is trying to give you a diverse group of those types of things. But if you ask for a specific image with historical context, it was ignoring what the historical context was. And in fact, there were some people who pointed out, Ben Thompson from Stratechery actually highlighted, like, no, you're just refusing to make white people. And it's like, that was the case. And he since deleted that post because Elon Musk responded to it, and you understand what happens on the internet when that happens. So that one doesn't exist anymore, but there's a great conversation about it on Dithering, which is the podcast he hosts with John Gruber, where, and Ben Thompson is not somebody who he stays away from politics. He stays away from cultural hot button issues. But the point was, like, you just built a thing that's so overcorrected for the systemic bias that exists in these training models that it became absurd. It was just ridiculous. And so then they shut off the image generation tool. So people started poking around with the text generation parts of it, and it was doing the same kind of thing. And so it's just, it's been bad. It's been a very, very bad couple of weeks for Google.
Right. And now I think this is in a response, like Google trying to err on the side of diverse depictions of people is because some of the earlier tests, and I say earlier like last year, when you would ask DALL-E or Midjourney to generate images of people, it would very often err on the side of just white people. Like, it's just what they depicted. And obviously that's not very representative either. And so Google is trying to, and Google does this a lot with their Pixel phones too. They really make a point to say that we are trying to make a product that is useful for all skin tones when it comes to cameras and photography. And so it is good to try and incorporate more diverse use cases and making it useful for everyone. But obviously when you're dealing with something historical, which I feel like, when it comes to these chatbots, it's clear that accuracy is it is a goal and it can be accurate, but everyone understands to be skeptical. And maybe this is part of a larger conversation, but I know one of the things, I made a video recently about mapping the action button to ChatGPT versus Siri, and how sometimes when I want to ask a question, like ChatGPT is just going to be better at answering it than Siri, because I know Siri is just going to send me to a website, basically like a web results. And if I'm asking like one of my HomePods, it's going to be like, yeah, we'll open this link on your phone. It's like, I don't want to do that. Like, I just want an answer. So one of the things I asked recently was just how far is the sun from Earth? And I asked both smart assistants, and ChatGPT actually rounded it and said something like 93 million miles. And then I asked Apple's assistant, and he gave a very specific number, which is kind of, you could say, more accurate. But then also the number Siri voiced to me was different than the number it showed in a web result on the same page. And so if accuracy is the question, I don't know if Apple's voice assistant is doing it that well either. I don't know, like maybe it's pulling from a different data source than it's displaying as a website. But I think people are going to start leaning more on these chatbots and large language models for information. And if that is the case, it needs to be accurate. And I think this being Google's chatbot is especially important because everyone goes to Google for information. That is literally Google search. That is the Google Assistant. I know a lot of people, when they talk about voice assistants in their home, their Google Home devices are the ones that provide better, more accurate information. And so of all the companies with a chatbot, and we'll get to Apple's responsibility in this in a moment, but Google needs to be pretty accurate. So
yeah, and I think that the intention was somewhat noble.
Sure.
Because you had talked about previous examples. And the previous example, so if you, a good way to think of this is if you were to ask it to give you, draw me or create an image of a CEO standing in front of a room of employees, right? Almost every time it would give you a white male, probably in their like 50s or 60s or something like that. And the reason for that is it's trained on, information from the internet, and the sample of images and of descriptions of that character, that stereotype often was of men, because for a long time that was the way, that was an accurate thing. Not that it should be that way, but that's what it is learning from. And so Google's like, but if all you're asking for is a CEO as a figure, it doesn't always have to be that, because that's not representative of the pool of human beings who are currently CEOs of companies. And it's trying to create something that's more reflective of that. That's different than if you said, create an image of the CEO of JP Morgan Chase Bank in 2023, which is Jamie Dimon, a white man with gray hair. Like, so if it returned a photo that way, that would be an accurate image. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be making a political statement one way or another. And I think that the goal was good. It's like, let's create diversity so that we aren't just spitting out more and reinforcing the same stereotype, because the truth is that as this thing creates content, that's the content that then gets fed back into the models. And so it's just self-perpetuating. And so I think that the goal was good, but it is really striking. And this should have been a warning to someone at Google, that if you type the same question into Google search and Google Gemini, you would get dramatically different answers, right?
That's true.
Because if you type it into Google search, it's just spitting back what's on the internet. But if you asked Google Gemini, it's like looking at what's on the internet and then trying to decide, is this a good answer, even if it's the accurate answer, and it's trying to give you the good answer, or what it thinks is good as defined by someone, as opposed to the accurate. And that's just where the disconnect was. And that was why I wrote the piece. Google CEO finally apologized and said, we got it wrong. And what he said was, our job is to build products that our users can trust, right? We have to, well, actually even better than that, they have to build products that deserve their users' trust. And that's, I think, why I think, like, the reason I put this in here is I honestly think that this could be fatal for Google. It could certainly be fatal for Sundar Pichai's role as a CEO. Because this is like an existential thing for Google. People go to Google because, even though we know that Google doesn't always get it right, we go to Google for information. So we depend on that information to be the information that we're asking for. And you do not want to feel like someone is hovering over you going, is that the question you should have been asking? Let me ask the question differently and give you an answer. Like, fine, there may be cases where there are some people who might need a little bit of guidance because the questions they're asking are ridiculous, but Google's not the one that should be making that determination, right? Like,
right. And, I do wonder, with the rise of, the Arc browser and Arc search apps, recently they released a new feature where you could basically like swipe to get a summary of an article. Like if you were looking at the New York Times article about the Apple car, that you could basically like swipe with two fingers and it'll give you a one paragraph summary of that, which it was actually doing it behind the paywall. So like that was kind of messy. But for if you were to ask a chatbot, like, give me a one paragraph summary of the 1900s, you might get like a lot of wars, a lot of people died. Like,
Yeah.
and that would be an accurate summary, but it lacks all nuance and other perspectives of those years. And I think this is going to be a tension going forward as AI chatbots and large language models try to like synthesize more and more information into smaller and smaller pieces, that things are going to get wonky, for lack of a better word. And
Yep.
especially if you look at history, but just, sometimes you do have to read a long article to truly understand something. Or this is, you need to read a research paper to understand this scientific study. And sometimes boiling it down to a single paragraph is actually not the best representation of the information, and it won't give you, the best understanding of it. But you had an article talking about Sundar Pichai's response to all of this. So tell us, like, what did he actually say and what are they doing moving forward?
So he didn't really apologize, and they said exactly what you'd expect, which is like, we're going to fix this, and we are going to, because we are dedicated to making products that our users can depend on and that deserve their trust. So I wrote this because I had written previously about how Google's previous response to this was not great. They were sort of trying to explain what had happened, but they weren't really taking responsibility for what was going on. And most importantly, the CEO hadn't said anything. And I think it was good that he finally responded, and it wasn't a public response. It was a memo to employees that was viewed by, I believe it was The Verge who saw this. And so I linked to their article because they had the full text of the entire statement, but it was something he sent to employees basically saying, we got it wrong. Like this was producing responses that were offensive for people, but which again is actually kind of not really what it was, because like I'm not offended by certainly the image you showed, which was of the German soldiers, could very well have been offensive to someone.
Sure.
To me, that image isn't specifically offensive. It's just absurd because it is so not an accurate image of what the person was asking for. Again,
Right.
whether you think that the request was in good faith or not is irrelevant to that. So I look at that and I'm like, it's not just that you were creating images that were offensive. It's just that you were inserting into this such a hedge against bias that you swung so far in the other direction that now people can't trust you. They can't trust the results that you're giving. And so I don't know. Like I've had several people ask me this. I would not be surprised when you look at the series of things that have happened over the last, how far behind Google has been in AI in general, how many things have happened in the last year or so, the discontent among employees. Like I told you this, I think I said this to you, that I've had conversations on different stories that I've worked on with people at Google who have essentially confirmed what we hear reported about the internal dissent and discontent happening at Google. It would not surprise me if Google has a different CEO by the end of this year. I just want to be on. I'm just going on record.
Now, what is the source of the discontent? Is that the push into AI is like cannibalizing their core competency of search, or like what is the rub?
So I think that the issue right now is that Google's internal culture is broken. So the piece that I wrote a week or so ago when this first happened was, it's bad that the technology failed, but what's even worse is that Google's culture right now is such that no one stood up and said, we shouldn't ship this, right? This is producing completely backwards results. We shouldn't actually put this out in the public because it's not ready, it's broken, it's not delivering the best answers to people's questions. And either people did say that and the people who were in charge were like, so what? We got to get this out there. Or no one was willing to stand up and say that. And that's a huge cultural problem for Google, that they have built a system where people are afraid to say something because they are worried about what that might mean for their job. I always say that like your brand is the way people think about your company. Your culture is the way your employees think about your company. And right now, the way that Google's employees think about its company is just not great. Wow. I mean, if you just think about the layoffs, like it was a little over a year ago, they laid off 12,000 people. This year so far, they've laid off over 1,000 more. and they constantly talk about like, we're doing this so that we can get our we can align our company with our strategy. That's not a direct quote, but the point is, you were the one that hired all the people in the first place because you thought that was your strategy. And so what you're saying is you were wrong, and yet you still have a job and you still have a paycheck. It's just all these employees that you hired to do the thing, and they were doing the thing you asked them to do, and now they don't get paid anymore. Like, I don't know.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I am curious. I think it's also telling how, OpenAI, like, this is all they're doing. Like, they're doing large language models, chatbots, or whatever. I think it's interesting to see the challenge of, I say, older tech companies, because compared to OpenAI, like Google, Microsoft, and Apple, which Microsoft just partnered with OpenAI, so they kind of like sidestepped this issue. But incorporating these newer AI technologies into long-standing technology stacks like Google and search, and Apple and its coming iOS 18 and iPhone 16, how that's going to square. Like, how is that actually going to be incorporated in a good way? And so I want to head to Apple's AI possibilities.